Michael Riedel has been the mischievous theatre columnist for the New York Post since 1998. He's just published this marvellous book, Razzle Dazzle, The Battle of Broadway, and today he's taking Broadway.com on a walking tour of the Great White Way. So Michael Riedel, we're at a bar, which is something we never do.
Where we often meet, darling. Holding this end up.
Sardi's.
Yes.
Now you've written this fantastic book. Tell
you.
me why you sort of did
Well,
it.
because for years I've been covering Broadway since 1989, and I heard great stories and anecdotes about the way business was when New York City was bankrupt, when Times Square was dangerous and full of prostitutes and pimps, and everybody thought Broadway was finished and it was over with. But there were a handful of people who stuck by Broadway in its hour of need, friends of ours, the Schuberts, the Nederlanders, Michael Bennett, Joe Papp, Cameron McIntosh, a minor composer called Imogen Lloyd Webber.
Don't know who he is.
And they turned it around because they had brilliant ideas for shows that people around the world wanted to see in a place called Times Square back in the 70s and 80s that nobody wanted to go to. New York City, back in the day when my book begins in the 70s, was hours away from going bankrupt. Hours away from going bankrupt. And nobody came to Times Square for any good reason. They only came to Times Square for bad reasons.
I do remember saying we're in the bar of Sardi's right now, that the bar staff used to have to be escorted to the subway, is that right?
That's right, yes. And Vincent Sardi hired guards to escort his staff to Port Authority to take the bus home to New Jersey. That's how dangerous this block was.
So talk to me about Sardi's and its importance and its history a bit. Why are we sitting in this bar to
Well,
kick off this interview?
Sardi's has, since the 1920s, really been the heart of Broadway. Every opening night and a few closing nights happened here at Sardi's in the heyday. Vincent Sardi Sr. had a little mom-and-pop Italian restaurant, and he catered to actors. The Schubert brothers, J.J. Schubert and Lee Schubert, they liked his food.
And
And
what time are we talking about
1920s.
this? Okay.
And in the 1920s, they built this building, which is 11 stories, which was a skyscraper back in 1920 here in Times Square. And they gave Vincent Sardi the ground floor to operate his restaurant out of. And on the top floor, which we will see, J.J. Schubert had his penthouse. So if ever he wanted spaghetti, he could take the elevator down and get it in Sardi's and take it up to his penthouse.
Now, what's the significance of this bar in particular?
The geography of Broadway, as we know it today, was created by Sam Schubert, Lee Schubert, and J.J. Schubert. The big theaters, they built. Lee Schubert died in 1953, J.J. died in 1963 with no heir. It was a family business with no heir. When J.J. died, they realized that a family member had to keep running the business because it was the Schubert family. So they allowed J.J. Schubert's nephew, Lawrence Schubert Lawrence, to take over the company. It turns out, as Bernie Jacobs said to me once, Lawrence Schubert Lawrence had alcohol in his system 24 hours a day. Here's to Larry. And on this bar, from this bar, Larry Schubert Lawrence ran the Schubert Empire because he did not want to be far away from a drink. And he had a phone installed here, so if he was at this end of the bar and drinking, he could just answer the phone. He had a phone installed at that end of the bar, so if he was at that end of the bar drinking, he wouldn't have to walk over to this phone, so he wouldn't fall on his face. And he ran this great empire of these Broadway theaters because of his drinking, because of his absolute, total non-interest in the theater world. He ran the Schubert organization into the ground. Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs, the two lawyers behind the scenes, to survive, they realized they had to get rid of Larry Schubert. And they staged a boardroom coup, and they pushed him out, and they took over the company for themselves. And they brought it back to this multi-billion-dollar entertainment empire it is today. And my book is about their struggle, about how they clawed their way back from the abyss.
And they got rid of the guy drinking at the bar.
They did, yeah. You know, it's funny. They turned him out, and he went down to Florida. And he always kept on his coffee table a book that was called The Evil That Lawyers Do, because he'd been ditched by his lawyers.
So Riedel, where are we?
We are about to enter J.J. Schubert's penthouse. the 11th floor of the Sardi building, and this was J.J. Schubert, the last surviving of the Schubert brothers who built the empire. It was Sam, Lee, and J.J. J.J. was the youngest. He lived until 1963. He lived here in this penthouse apartment. But for years, no one had seen him because he was lost in the fog of dementia. This empire that he created was kind of running by itself. And no one had seen him for a long time because he just lived up here sequestered. And his nickname around Broadway back in the 60s, ironically, was the Phantom. And little did he know that one day, a little tiny show called The Phantom of the Opera would bring more money for the Schubert organization than any show in the history of any Broadway musical. Da-dee-da-dee-da-da. J.J. Schubert, who often went to Europe to scout out new shows, back then he didn't find any Andrew Lloyd Webber shows because it was a little before your dad's time. But, but he found a Venetian door in a palazzo. And he found 2 of them, actually. And it took 10 men to bring this door up here in his penthouse apartment and install this door. He probably was attracted to it because he liked showgirls with big breasts, and this one has 6 breasts. And this was here. There is somewhere another door, the companion of this door, which for a while was in the basement of the Court Theater. It's not there anymore. It has disappeared. We were just in J.J. Schubert's living room, but now we're in his dining room.
Which is some space.
And he had this beautiful Tiffany glass skylight installed so that the sun could shine down on all of the chorus girls I'm sure he entertained in this room.
Didn't he marry a chorus girl?
He married 2.
As you do.
So this is Michael Bennett, the creator of A Chorus Line and Dreamgirls, and someone I would argue in my book not only saved Broadway, but also helped save New York City. Because in 1974, Michael Bennett, who was a choreographer, who worked on Follies and Company for Hal Prince and Steve Sondheim, Michael wanted to be a director. And he had danced in the chorus of Broadway shows. And one night he gathered together all of his friends who were dancers in Broadway shows, who were gypsies, and a big reel-to-reel tape recorder. They opened several bottles of cheap wine and smoked a lot of pot. I'm telling you, I've heard the tapes. And Michael recorded their stories. They talked about their lives. Many came from broken homes, had sexual identity issues. They were sad kids who found comfort on Broadway and in Broadway shows. And they were the anonymous dancers in Broadway musicals. And Michael took those interviews, those tape-recorded interviews, to Joe Papp down at the Public Theater, and he played those interviews for about 15 minutes for Joe. And Joe Papp said, "It's interesting, I don't know what it is, I'll give you a rehearsal space and some money, go to work."
And that became
And
a chorus
from
line.
those tapes, A Chorus Line
So
happened.
that happened at the Public Theatre.
And
then
it moved
uptown to the
Schubert Theatre.
which is where we're now going to.
And remember, back then, the Schubert Empire was about to go into bankruptcy. They had no shows. And suddenly, this weird-looking little guy came up with this thing called A Chorus Line that moved to the Schubert Theatre and ran 15 years.
So, Riedel, we're outside the Schubert Theatre. Which Schubert is the theatre named after?
It is named after Sam Schubert. Sadly, Sam Schubert died when he was 31 years old. He was going down to Pittsburgh to buy a theater on the train, and his train collided with a munitions train, and there was an explosion, and he was burnt to a crisp.
Now
And they named this theater the Sam S. Schubert Memorial Theater. But they realized, Lee and JJ, that the word memorial is kind of depressing. So they got rid of memorial, and now it's just known as the Schubert.
Theatre. And we're now going to go and have a look at the heart of the Schubert Empire.
The inner sanctum, where the power, the absolute power resides on Broadway. Door of power into the inner sanctum of the Schubert Empire. I'm scared, Imogen.
So I am on my knees, which is actually an important place to be, because this is the most important man on Broadway, everybody. This is Phil Smith, who runs the Schubert organization. You run 17 Broadway theatres. You've been there through it all. You helped Michael Riedel write his book. Talk to me about the first time you came across Chorus Line.
The first time? Down at the Newman Theater.
Yeah.
Went down to see it at the request of Michael Bennett. He called Bernie Jacobs and asked that Bernie and I go down there and see the show. When we got down there were no tickets for us. They were all sold out. So we had to sit on the steps.
That's a good sign. That's a good sign. You thought we probably want this show for our theatre, no?
We sat on the steps. And that wasn't the first time. We sat on the steps many times after that. Because Michael would come down and call and say, I just changed something. I'd like you guys to come down and look at it.
And this was at the Chorus Line, so you kept going back down.
You go running down there. But the problem is there was sometimes I have to say, Michael, what did you change?
You couldn't tell.
Can't tell what he changed. He changed something. Didn't you notice? And he'd start telling you. And now I notice, yeah, but I didn't notice before.
So how did Cats come about? How did you get, because Cats was a big hit in London, how did you manage to get it into a Schubert theatre on Broadway and not let it go to the Nederlanders?
Well, the truth of the matter is that we have to thank Tyler Gatchell, Lord rest his soul. Tyler was a good friend and a very good general manager and a very good friend to Andrew. Wherever Andrew had something playing, he ran and saw it and covered it and reported to Andrew what was happening. And he met Bernie in London and said to Bernie, there's a play over here, Cats. You've got to go see it. Andrew has it. And I don't think anyone else has it right now, so you can get it.
And it went into the Winter Garden, and
Right.
cut a long story short, it was very important for Broadway at the time because it helped clean up the
Absolutely,
area because
sure
families
did.
were coming in.
It did. It really did. Andrew said he would like to have it appear on different than a theater, so we went looking on 42nd Street to see if we could find a place on 42nd Street.
And at the time, that was rough, wasn't it, at the time?
It was terrible. You could buy anything that was illicit. It was on sale. And Bernie and I went to 8th Avenue and then walked from 8th Avenue to Broadway on 42nd. We were offered everything in creation, you know, whatever you want. You want it in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. And Bernie said, we have to tell Andrew, we can't put a show here, it'd be ridiculous.
And the other big Andrew Lloyd Webber show that's still in a Schubert theatre here on Broadway
Oh,
is,
boy.
of course, Phantom, right there. And you were very instrumental in making sure, again, it went into a Schubert theatre because it was a bit of a close-run thing, I understand, from Michael
Oh,
Riedel's
it's a
Razzle Dazzle.
very close run thing. But I got it back.
You got it back.
Got it back. And I got after a little time after getting it back, I got a call from your father saying, when can I look at the theater, Phil? I said, when do you want to? He said, well, whenever is good. I said, how about now? He said, I'm here with Sarah, and she wants to see it also. So off we
And
went.
that would be Sarah Brightman, my ex-stepmother.
Sarah
who was
Brightman,
the original
yeah.
Christine in Phantom. And you took them both round,
Right?
and you basically talked them into going.
Well,
Into
I had one
Majestic.
frightening moment there. We were showing her around the theater, Sarah. And she said, I'd like to go up and see the balcony. And Andrew said, oh, darling, I'm tired. I don't want to go up there. And I said, I'll take you up, I said. I should have said, I'm tired also, but I didn't, foolishly. We get up there, so quite a hike up to the balcony in the Majestic. And we get up there, and she says, boy, this is big. I said, no, it's a very intimate theater. It's an intimate musical. That's compared to Madison Square Garden, and Yankee Stadium, places like that. So at any rate, to make a long story short, then we start coming down, and we get to that staircase right above the concession stand on the main floor. And you're up about 4 or 5 steps. And Andrew then comes around, and I don't know, he must have been outside for some reason or other, and he came walking in. And he said, Sarah, darling, isn't it wonderful? And she says, yes, Andrew, but isn't it a little large, don't you think?
And?
Your father said, this is where they sang One Enchanted Evening 8 times a week, darling. And that ended the conversation.
That was it. Schubert's got Phantom. All right, so this was the original Schubert safe where they kept all the money. So Riedel, we're outside the Majestic Theatre, which has had some extraordinary musicals in it.
This is one of the great Schubert musical houses of all time. This is where South Pacific played with Mary Martin and Ezia Pinza. This is where the Music Man played. But if you look closely, Imogen, and I don't know if you know this, see that face?
Yeah.
That face used to be an old Broadway actress, but it's been changed, and now it's the face of Imogen Lloyd Webber.
All right, so the Phantom was sort of part of a British invasion, as it were. It
Right.
really kicked off with Cats, but Les Mis.
Right, I mean,
Saigon.
we fought a revolution to get away from you people, but then your father and Cameron McIntosh recolonized this whole part of America called Broadway. But I think what happened was, and this is kind of a sad part of the book, the AIDS crisis hit in the 80s. And a lot of the great Broadway directors, principally Michael Bennett, died of AIDS. And a lot of people who would have kept that tradition of the director choreographer in the theater, all those kids who danced in the course of the shows, they died of AIDS. And there was a void. That was really the end of the American musical theater for a while. And what I think your father did was significant in the history of Broadway. He came with shows that were about the score, that were about the music. It was no longer dance driven. The score was the star. Da dee da. Here comes the chandelier. Dee 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 dee.
Riedel, we're outside what many people think is the finest theatre on Broadway, the Mark Hellinger.
Yes.
It's now a church, but it has an extraordinary history, doesn't it?
Yes, this theater is where My Fair Lady played. It's where Jesus Christ Superstar played. It's where Sugar Babies played. It is an Art Deco masterpiece, named after, by the way, Mark Hellinger, who was a Broadway columnist in his day. But sadly, it is no longer a Broadway theater because in the 1980s, Jimmy Niederlander, who owned it for a while.
So going back a bit, we have the Schuberts, who are this big theatre family who own 17 Broadway theatres, and the Niederlanders, who own a certain number of other Broadway theatres.
The rivals of the Schuberts, the Niederlanders.
The Schuberts are doing very well on Broadway. They've got Cats, they've got Phantom, they're doing very well.
They got
But the
Les Miserables.
Niederlanders are running into money problems in the 1980s.
They're having trouble, and Jimmy Niederlander, who created the Empire, he puts a show in here called Legs Diamond, starring Peter Allen, the Australian guy that Hugh Jackman played in The Boy from Oz. And Legs Diamond is a total fiasco. And Jimmy Niederlander loses $5 million on the show. And he's now pinched for cash. And he makes a deal with the Times Square Church to lease this theater to the church. And people were outraged because this is one of the great musical houses on Broadway. And how could Jimmy Niederlander lease it to a church? And he's interviewed by the New York Times, and they ask him this question, and he says, "I'm in the theater business. I take the next booking." And the next booking happened to be a church.
But I'm also right in thinking that the Niederlanders didn't want to sell this theatre in the end to a competitor.
Well, not to tell too many tales out of school, but your father would have bought this theater. Cameron McIntosh would have bought this theater from Jimmy Niederlander, and they would have kept it as a musical theater house. And I did ask Jimmy Niederlander for this book, why didn't you sell to Andrew? Why didn't you sell to Cameron? And he said, why sell to a competitor? A brilliant business decision. He took it off the market.
The best theatre on Broadway. So if you want to come to the best theatre on Broadway, you
gotta
need to go and pray.
Exactly.
Right.
Salve Maria.
So Riedel, you've written this incredible book, which pains me to say, but it really is incredible. And for anyone who loves Broadway, they need to read it. Your arguments to me sort of seems to be that Broadway really was the main artery of New York City and has sort of kept it going.
When my book really takes place in the 1970s, this city was bankrupt. This city was down and out. But this city has one thing going for it. One thing that no other city in the world has, and that's Broadway. And that's those Broadway theaters and those shows that went into those theaters at a time when this city, the world had turned its back on New York. But then there was a chorus line. And then there was 42nd Street. And then there was Cats and Les Miserables and Phantom of the Opera. And those shows in these great theaters turned Times Square and New York City around. And today, if you can swing over here, you look at the multi-gazillion-dollar Wicked, which everyone around the world has heard of. And that's how important Broadway is to New York City.
Thank you very much, Michael Riedel.
A pleasure, darling.